good to see you. You're starting as close to 9:30 as I possibly can start. I guess I could have actually started at 9:30, but hey, stay lovely. Welcome back to week 2 of It's Okay to Love Jesus and Have a Therapist. This is week 2. The purpose of this class, as you'll recall, is that we want to have a dialogue about mental health issues and how those impact us, how they impact our faith, how they impact our friends, how they impact, people we meet randomly on the street. And the reason we're having this dialogue is because this is a discipleship issue, that we want to help people of all shapes and sizes, of all mental health statuses, to draw closer to Jesus, to have a faith that grows, that is strengthened, that flourishes. We want to invite all people. Mason, they're in room 103, buddy. We want to invite all people to be part of our church, to use their gifts to lift up the body, to encourage us in our walk, as we also encourage them. And then lastly, this class is dedicated to equipping us for being supportive, for being present. We are not here to solve people's problems. That is not our job. We're not here to turn people into projects. That's also not our job. We are here to love and to support and to be mutually discipled by each other, and that's what we're trying to do. So, that's kind of the overarching goal. Today's class, we will do the following activities. We're going to talk about suffering. Yeah. Nothing like waking up early in the morning and talking about such a simple idea of suffering. Then we're going to talk about the difference between snarl and purr words and how that relates to the topic of mental illness. And then finally, we're going to begin talking about factors that impact mental health issues. I had this brilliant idea that we were going to finish it today, and then I wrote the lesson. We didn't even get started because there were other things that I wanted to say. So it's a 2-weeker. So woohoo! So that's what we're going to begin doing today, is exploring from theological perspectives, from economic perspectives, from environmental perspectives, from biological perspectives, yada, yada, yada. See, I even say it out loud and I think, oh, silly 2 weeks ago, Kyle. You bit off more than you could chew. But before we get into all of that, let's pray. Most holy and righteous God, we are in awe of who you are, your character, of your holiness, your justice, of your loving kindness to us all. We thank you for inviting us into your presence, for making covenant with us through Jesus. We thank you for blessing us in all of the ways that you have blessed us. Father, forgive us of our sins and help us to be a people who forgive those who sin against us. And come quickly, Lord Jesus, so that we may dance in eternity with you. Father, we pray for our friends who have yet to put their hope in Christ. We pray that they will come to share the faith that we have. Use us to be a blessing to them, to plant a seed, to nourish a seed, for your glory, for the healing of our community. Until the time of Christ's return, help us to be as faithful as we can be. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do this morning is we're going to have a little table chat on this really simple topic: why is there pain and suffering? Okay, so I need you to solve this equation very quickly at your tables. But really, at your tables, just from your perspective, when you talk about this with your friends, Pavel and Jim will be talking to themselves. Why do you see pain in the world? Why do you see suffering? How do you answer this question of why? It's a question we all ask. It's a question our friends ask. So we need to be in this mindset, and I'll explain why further down the road, but it's important that we start here. So you have 7 minutes to talk about that, and then we'll come back together. On your mark, get set, go. All right, so we are going to now turn to Matthew chapter 9. If you have your Bibles, I'm going to turn there with us. Matthew chapter 9, starting in verse 32. We will read through verse 38. Matthew chapter 9, starting in verse 32. We will read through verse 38. And as we do this, I want you to think about this question. Who are the bad guys in this story? Who are the people who cause suffering, who cause harm, etc., etc., etc.? As they were going away, behold, a demon-oppressed man who was mute was brought to him. And when the demon had been cast out, the mute man spoke, and the crowds marveled, saying, "Never was anything like this seen in Israel." But the Pharisees said, "He casts out demons by the prince of demons." And Jesus went throughout all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom, healing every disease and every affliction. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them, because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore, pray earnestly to the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest." Okay, so I want you to take the story that we just read, and if there's also time, think about the parable of the Good Samaritan that we read last week, which is Luke 10, verses 25 through 37. And at your tables, I want you to answer the question, between these two stories, who would you label as the bad guys? Who are the ones who are causing harm, who are inflicting suffering on others? And I'll give you a few minutes to do that, and then we'll come back and hopefully put it all together in a way that makes sense to you. All right, so on your mark, get set, go. Okay, let's come back together. So, bad guys discussed. I would assume everyone at some point in the conversation said Pharisees, right? Show of hands. All right, good deal. You can all mark Pharisee on your bingo card. Well done. Anyone say demons? We point to demons. Good. You all read the passage. So we got those two. Like, those are the obvious ones. And then if we think a little bit more, go a little bit more deeper, you've got crowds who are afflicted and suffering for all kinds of ways. So you could say some of the bad guys are those forces that bring out sicknesses for all of the variety of ways that sicknesses arrive. You've got within Israel itself a lot of social stigma towards people who are sick. Lepers are secondary citizens in the kingdom. If they're even secondary, they're probably like much further down on the list. You've got probably the Roman imperial system that creates hierarchies and all of that could go into that. But not only the Pharisees, as Jesus mentions, or as the story mentions, when Jesus looks at the crowd, they're like a sheep without a shepherd. So you could also think about the entire leadership of Israel, who should be guiding the people, who should be leading the people, and yet what we find more often than not in the Gospels is that the leaders are failing the people they're supposed to be serving. And if you got to the Good Samaritan, you've got the lawyer who's there to test Jesus. He's a clear bad guy. He tries to justify himself when it turns out that Jesus knows more than the guy thinks he does. Then within the parable, you've got the robbers who are like some pretty bad robbers. Like, they don't just take his money. They like beat him up and leave him naked in the street. Like, that's a whole other level of robbery that I just don't ever want to participate in or be the victim of, mind you. You've got the Levite and the priest, these guys who see this hurting person but walk to the other side. And you could maybe build a case that the Levite and the priest are doing what they're supposed to do. Because they're probably on their way to the temple. They're going to do their religious things. And if you touch a dead body, you're unclean and you can't do your things. But that probably just helps us understand that they're a part of a system that leads to people who are hurting, who are broken, who need the most help, not being able to find it from the people who are supposed to help them. So you got all of these factors at play. Now, did anyone discuss the bad guy being the crowds themselves who are afflicted and hurting? Did anyone discuss the guy who got robbed as being a bad guy in his own story? No, we didn't. If you did, then you're probably a bad person. I don't know. but the stories are not written for us to think about that. Like if you did, you'd probably be very heartless. It's very clear within these narratives who the victims are. The dude who's just walking, on the road from Jericho to Jerusalem. These crowds who have bad leadership, who are sick. Like, they're not the bad guys. It's super easy to figure out who's good and who's bad in the Bible. It's really clear sometimes. And then we get to the real world of our day. Not that the Bible world wasn't real, it's just it was explained for us. But it's not always explained for us today. Who's good, who's bad, who's the villain, who's the victim. Sometimes you get boots on the ground, and it can be very hard to make those kinds of discernments. Now, why are we talking about this? We're talking about this because sometimes when we enter into life with people who have mental health issues, one of the places our mind goes is, what did that person do to get to where they are? How is it this person's fault? Oh, you have depression. Well, why can't you be happier? Oh, you have anxiety. Well, haven't you read to just cast all your anxieties on Him? You should read the Scriptures more. I'm not saying that we all do this. I'm not saying that anyone in this room does this. I don't know. I don't know your whole life story. But I have friends who have felt blamed for their own problems, who felt blamed for their own illnesses. Now, it's a little more nuanced than that, right? Like, if somebody breaks their leg, you're going to ask how that happened. And if it turns out that they did something kind of dumb, well, then they were, of course, a cause of their own broken leg. You could argue that maybe addictions are done by the choices we make, but even then, if you think about it, addictions often are born out of childhood traumas and other traumas experienced, and it's all complicated, it's all nuanced. And the point that I'm making here is because it is so complicated, we don't start from the point of whose fault it is. We start from the point of compassion, from the point of love. And in compassion, as Jesus has, as the guy, the hero of the parable of the Good Samaritan, or the Good Samaritan, we want to move towards the hurting. Not to point the finger, but to pick them up and to walk with them. Because in Christianity, the weak are born by the strong. The strong walk with the weak. It's what we do. And so that's kind of what we're doing. Because it can be so easy to look at someone, whether they have a mental health issue or whether they're just, whoever they are, and to see them as a label, to see them as a negative, as a stereotype, as that I was talking to Aaron and I went to a gas station this past week. I hadn't been to in 2 years because I had one negative experience with it 2 years ago. And it was the worst gas station ever. It was slow. It took me 30 minutes to pump my tank. The person was rude. And I was like, I'm done with this place. And then we went back. And it was all great. It's like, man, I could have given this place another shot after they got bought by new owners. But sometimes I think we treat people like that. We have one experience, it's negative, and we instantly write them off. That person is a grumpicus. That person is drama. That person is always angry. That person is mean. We label people, and we are drawn away from them. And when we do that, we stop seeing them as people who bear the image of God. We stop seeing them as the ones who God created to bear His image and His likeness. All human beings, regardless of circumstance, regardless of choices, they will always, at the end of the day, still be someone who bears the image and likeness of God. That never changes. And the hardest part is to remember that and to keep giving them the dignity and respect that is born from that identity. I'm not saying there aren't consequences to choices. I'm not saying any of that. I'm saying at the end of the day, we must work because of compassion to keep seeing people not as their label, but as the image bearer of God that they are. Just like me and just like you. So, part of this whole journey that I've been on for the last few years is about listening and about trying to understand other perspectives. And this past week, I got invited into a conversation about why maybe I should move away from the phrase mental illness and move more towards the phrase mental health issue. And what was explained to me is that mental illness has a negative feeling and mental health issue has a positive feeling. And then another person just happened to have this conversation with me. We were having dinner at a delicious steakhouse. I'd never been there. It's, where is it? Sutter Street Steakhouse? Is that it? Okay. If you haven't ever been there, you should. Tell them Kyle sent you and they'll give you 10% off.
That's it?
Okay, that's not true, but I like to throw a little chaos into the world. And what they were explaining to me was the reason of this conversation is it's the difference between snarl words and purr words. This idea was kind of developed by a guy named S.I. Hayakawa. That's probably not how you pronounce that name. He was a professor of English and general semantics and then later became a U.S. senator, so that's fun. So a snarl word is a word that is used to induce a negative response or a negative association in the person who is hearing or reading this word. A word like a purr word, we'll talk about the differences. A purr word is a word that is used to induce a positive response in the person who's reading or hearing this. So I think it's the difference between the word argument and the word debate. Okay, think about the word argument. Sit in that word. Okay? Now, technically speaking, an argument is just a course of reasoning aimed at demonstrating that a statement is true or false, right? But that's probably not how we always use that word. In fact, more often than not, we use argument to talk about a heated discussion we had with our spouse or friend that was emotional and was heavy, and we were angry, and they were clearly wrong, and I was clearly right because they weren't listening to me. I even had to Google it to prove them wrong. And then that's how that resolved, because I Googled it, and they're like, oh, you were right, and I was wrong, and your wisdom is so much better than mine. That's how arguments always end. Clear winners, clear losers, right? No. So the word argument evokes a negative response in us because we have a negative experience with this word, even though it's technically the same meaning for a debate. Two people reasoning, trying to demonstrate whether something is true or false. But you hear the word debate, and you don't, at least I don't, maybe you do, maybe your experience is one of a traumatic debate team from high school, I don't know. But when you hear the word debate, we usually think more about someone having a reasonable discourse with their facts and their evidence, and there's no emotion involved, and it's wonderful, and everyone's happy at the end. So if you think about mental illness and mental health in these terms, mental illness is a bad thing. It has a negative feeling. It's the dark monster that stalks the minds of our friends and our family. In the media, mental illness is why there are school shootings or muggings or whatever. Mental illness is a monster. It's heavy. It's weighted. Mental health issue. It's a lighter phrase. I think it's actually a better phrase, not just because it has a less negative feeling to it, but it also gives us a goal. Health. It gives us a direction to walk towards. It gives us purpose. It also gives us something that everyone wants for themselves, and ideally you want for other people, right? You want health for your life, whatever that looks like. You want other people to be healthy, at least reasonable, decent human beings are not walking around thinking, how can I make someone unhealthy today? Some of you might. I don't know your stories. I'm going to assume you're all good people, though, and that can be between you and God. Health is a thing we strive for. A mental health issue, then, is something we work through on our way to health. And so I'm going to try to use that phrase more. I invite you to use that phrase more. If you don't, I'm not going to judge you. I don't think anyone in here is going to judge you for it. And I don't think anyone you come into contact with will judge you. But I think it's important as we think through what we're trying to do. We're not trying to beat back mental illness. We're trying to bring people to mental health. And because that's what Jesus does. Jesus brings us into the presence of God. Jesus brings us into salvation, out of suffering. So we started this morning talking about answering the question, why is there pain? Why is there suffering? It's this giant philosophical and theological question that people have been wrestling with since the dawn of time. And as I was preparing for this class, it felt like something we should talk about at least briefly. And then I read a book called Blessed Are the Crazy by Sarah Griffith Lund. And she takes this question of why is there pain, why is there suffering? And she relates it to her own personal experiences of mental health. And she spins it a bit based on her experience. And so I just want to read what she says. Where is God in the midst of our suffering? And why do bad things happen to good people? We all wonder this, and many of us ask the question readily when something bad happens. But what if the something bad is not an event, like a car accident, but instead something inextricable from our very being? If we believe that God knits us together in our mother's wombs, do we therefore believe that God knits crazy into our being? If God is in all places and is present at all times, is God also in mental illness? If we are made in God's image, then is God crazy too? Or is mental illness one of those things Satan uses to undo us? A case could be made that Satan, at the very least, has a knack for this kind of thing, regardless of whether he is actually at the root of it. So it's important to know where Sarah's writing from. She grew up with a father who had an undiagnosed bipolar disorder for much of her life. And because of it, her mom had to leave. I think they were living in California, and moved to Missouri to escape his violent rages, his harmful decisions. Later on in life, Sarah's brother would also be diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Sarah had an adopted cousin who was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Sarah's a follower of Jesus, and she writes from a perspective of someone who wakes up fairly regularly and wonder if her time is coming. Is today the day that something erupts within me? Is today the moment that I follow in the footsteps of my father and my brother? And I don't love, but I appreciate the way she talks about this question. Because when I think about why is there pain, I'm always thinking about like the outside events, the externals. But she brings up this internal thing, this thing that didn't happen to her, but is born from within her. And so her question is not why is there pain, but her question might be summed up as, what if I'm the pain? What if I'm the problem? I get why someone would ask that question. At least on some level I can understand it. It's not abstract anymore. It's not theoretical. It's personal. And so as we go into this conversation about factors, we're not having conversations about theories. We're having conversations about people. People who wake up with these questions. People who are made in the image of God and yet wonder where God is in their lives. Not by the choices they made, but by, I don't know, the hand they were dealt. And that can be very sobering. It can be very difficult. And it's not enough to say, well, God loves you. Thumbs up. And sometimes the best thing is to not say anything at all. And yeah, we are absolutely impacted by the events of our lives. We are formed and we are shaped, but we are not defined by them. Ever. We are not defined by our pain. We are not defined by our problems. We are, at the end of the day, people who are created in the image and likeness of God. And as Christians, we are defined by the grace and redemption that came to us on the cross, the resurrection, and the ascension of Christ. And that we must lean into, and that we must help others lean into as well. So, just a couple of thoughts, and then we will be on our way. Before we even talk about factors, I think it's important to talk about why this conversation is both unhelpful and why it can also be very helpful. It can be unhelpful, to talk about factors that impact mental health issues, because knowing the cause doesn't necessarily always bring about the solution. Just because you know why someone develops an anxiety disorder or why someone has PTSD doesn't mean that will help them move towards health. It doesn't guarantee that A plus B equals C. in my very limited experience in talking with people, it seems like A plus B equals C for some, but other times A plus F equals E. Or 1 plus 9 equals 47. It's not linear, it's not always logical. And so just because you know how something came about, I mean, maybe that helps, but maybe it doesn't. Another reason why this is unhelpful is because, how do I say this? Just because you know one story doesn't mean you know every story. Just because you know one person who lives with depression doesn't mean that you know what it's like to live with depression. It doesn't mean you know the person down the street who lives with depression. It doesn't mean you know the person down the block who lives with depression, because the illness is as varied as the person experiencing it. The health issue is as individualized as you and I are. And so sometimes we can have these conversations. This happened to me recently. It wasn't related to a mental health issue. And I'm going to remember that we're recording this and putting it online, so I'm not going to give you all the details. But I have a friend who's making a very poor moral choice, in my eyes. Bad. And I was going to some friends who I was seeking prayers, just prayers. I wasn't looking for advice, but they're a group of preachers, so, preachers like to be given advice. And I appreciate it, I really did. And so some people were saying, well, here's one of the reasons why people make this choice. And then someone else said, well, here's another reason why someone would make this really, really, really bad moral choice. And here's some statistics, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they're all right, and they're all good, and it's all wonderful. And then I had one friend call me. He said, all of that's good, and I don't want to downspeak anybody, but none of that matters, because you don't know her. You don't know this person's story. If you go in there with answers when you haven't even asked the question yet, you're only going to do more harm than good. And I started to think about the way I tend to approach life, and how often I go with answers before I even ask the question. Like, I've read the studies, I know why people do the things that they do, at least I have a fairly good idea of the possible options. And so I just enter into the room with the answers in my head. Now, whether you think I have the answers is a totally different story all unto itself. But in my head, I have the answers. Here I am. Let me tell you the questions that you aren't even asking of yourself. Ha ha, I'm so wise. And all that does is create divide. Because people want statistics, people want stereotypes. And so these kinds of conversations, if we lean a certain direction with them, will actually only hinder us from being able to be supportive. We have these conversations, we look at these factors for some good reasons, but it's not to give you the answers to the question. It's to help you understand what potentially someone is going through, to build empathy and compassion. And in compassion, we learn to listen and love. But these kinds of conversations aren't meaningless either. Otherwise, I wouldn't do them, because I don't like wasting my time. I think it can be very helpful to understand that sometimes people don't always have the control we think they do. That control is such a mythological idea that we like to believe we have. But sometimes I think about the things that I do or believe or think or like and wonder, well, why did I really make the choice? Like, when I was a little kid, did I really choose to like broccoli? Like, I ate it, and my taste buds were like, ugh, I do not like this. That's the response that happened with my taste buds, and then my brain was like, this is a feeling that I do not appreciate, I would like to move away from. And then I would eat potatoes, and my taste buds were like, oh, I really like potatoes. And that went up to my brain, I was like, oh, this is a feeling I like to experience. Like, I didn't objectively sit and look at broccoli and then determine that I would like it or not. It was just an experience that happened with my tongue. And then my mom said, that doesn't matter, eat your broccoli. And it's like, okay. And then later in life, I learned to love broccoli. When I was growing up, I had a cat allergy. My wife says I didn't, but she was wrong. I had a cat allergy. I would go over to my friend's house. He had a cat. His name was Figaro, rest in peace. And I could be over there about 2.5 hours before my eyes would just be itching like crazy, and my I'd be perspiring like I was, sportsing or something. And then one day, for whatever reason, I stopped having a cat allergy. I bought a little kitten, and I didn't sneeze, and I didn't itch, and it was like, oh, apparently you can outgrow allergies. To which my wife says, no, you just never had a cat allergy, it was all in your mind. I'm like, no, that's not true. You did too say that. You most certainly did. I have it on recording as evidence. But the record showed. So when it comes to mental health issues, sometimes there are factors at play that we really don't have any control over. The second thing that I think is important to have these conversations is that the factors that impact mental health are in the same way the same factors that impact physical health. The same thing. It might not always be easy to remember that mental health disorders and physical health disorders, they're not really all that far apart. They're actually very, very well connected. A lot of mental health issues are dealing with your brain, dealing with chemicals. Those are physical things. The problem is, and what makes this such a difficult conversation to have is, at least I can't see the brain. Right? I can't look at somebody and see their cerebellum and their amygdala. And I know those words because we recently bought a book for Isaac about the brain, so I recently read them. It's rather fresh on my mind. I don't look at someone and think, okay, so what's going on in their frontal cortex? That's just not how we work. There is an invisibleness to this, and so we have to keep reminding ourselves that mental health issues, physical health issues, they're both physical. There's a substantive connection there. It's not just quote unquote in the mind. You're not just losing your marbles. It's not just all in your head as if it's not real. It's very real. We have these conversations because when you forget that something is real for someone, you tend to be dismissive, at least I do. We tend to not care as much. And when we don't care as much, we don't support. So for instance, in his book, Mental Health in the Church, author Stephen, I'm not going to pronounce his name right, so it starts with a G and ends with an ick. He received an email from a mom talking about the different ways she experienced support from her church when it came to her daughter's physical illnesses versus her mental health issues. And in the email she says this: "My daughter, when she was 13, was hit by a car and fortunately was fine, except a very bad broken leg. The church organized a brigade of casserole makers. The neighbors brought casseroles, friends and families, everybody brought casseroles." I think this was from the South, because West Coast people don't make casseroles. Which is not a bad thing either, but anyway. 6 months before that, my daughter spent 2 months in a psychiatric ward, and we had no casseroles. I'm not blaming the church, I'm not blaming the neighbors or anything. See, because of the stigma, we didn't tell people. So there's a difference in experience, because she felt, whether this is true or not, right? We don't know. She felt like she couldn't talk about her daughter's psychological struggles, her mental health issues, and so she didn't tell anybody. And there's a part of me that says, well, that's on her, right? She didn't tell people. We didn't know she needed casseroles. We didn't know they were struggling because she didn't open it up. But then there's another part of me that recognizes that even if she had, I cannot say with confidence that the amount of support she would have received would have been equal. There would have been some very compassionate people who would have been like, yeah, this is the thing, let's help her out. And there are others that would be like, I don't know about that. I don't know about psychology, and I don't know about mental health stuff. And that's just an experience. It's true. It's how people think. And it's not to throw anyone under the bus at all. It's not to say, oh, boo on that church and boo on those neighbors. How do they not know these things? That's why we talk about them, so that people can know about this, so we can be there and be supported and be comforted. And so this is where we end our conversation today. To remind ourselves that mental health issues are just as important to be compassionate towards as physical health issues. And the way that we move to keep those two in order is by dialoguing as we're doing, Because in dialoguing, we normalize experiences. Depression, anxiety, PTSD, schizophrenia, etc., etc., etc. These are not the big bad wolves that are invisible and plaguing us. And we, like little pigs, build houses of straw. These are not demons that stalk us in the night. And people who live with mental health issues are not demons themselves who should be disregarded and cast out into the darkness until they get their lives better, until they pull themselves up by their bootstraps. People struggle. And because we love them, we listen. We examine and we explore and we discuss. And in doing that, we create an open environment for those who are hurting. And in doing that, we get to learn from this woman's experience. So that if that happens to somebody in our church, we will respond with casseroles or KFC or whatever food. We will respond with support. Because the goal is to help people know that they are welcome, that they are loved, and that their issues are not a problem. And that they're not a problem. They're loved by Jesus, and they're loved by us. So next week, we're going to talk about the theology of these conversations. We're going to talk about environmental factors and biology. And it'll be super fun and interesting. And yay. So thanks for being here, and have a great day. We'll see you at church.